All righty. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, we're going to have Dr. Jeff Daniels, who is a member of West Virginia University College of Applied Human Sciences in the School of Counseling and Wellbeing. Let's see, his research is focused on violence prevention and mitigation. He conducted studies on averted school shootings and school captive taking. This led to a partnership with the then FBI Behavioral Science Unit, where they developed a collaboration project, which was called the Global Hostage Taking Research and Analyst Projects, known as Ghost Trap. I love these FBI names here, where they interviewed individuals convicted of kidnapping or hostage taking. Ghost Trap then led to a collaboration with the FBI's law enforcement officers killed and assaulted, or LEOTA, I think I'm saying that right, a program within the Criminal Justice Information Services Division. With this group, they studied ambushes against law enforcement officers, analyzing interviews with surviving officers, witness officers, and the offenders who ambushed them. You also have, Jeff has also co-authored the book, Fatal Grievances, Forecasting and Preventing Active Killer Threats in Schools, Campus, and Workplace Setting. Jeff earned his PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Please help me welcome Jeff Daniels. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm excited to be here. When I first got the email inviting me to do this, it was kind of a no-brainer for me. It was, I think it's a great opportunity, and I'm looking forward to this today, and hopefully we can have some good discussion and some questions. So kind of reiterating a little bit of that, I wasn't sure how much intro I would get. I did come to WVU in 2008, so I consider myself a mountaineer Husker. So I love both of these universities. I'd like to acknowledge off the front the co-authors of the book that's forthcoming, which is due out in December. And in fact, we just got the proofs this afternoon, and I haven't had a chance to look at those yet. But so the first author is Greg Vecchi, and Greg is a person who I met probably in 2006, and we've worked collaboratively since then. And then Dr. Marianne Markey, who's our second author on this book. So why am I here? Why did I get to this point in my career? Probably like many of you, my career was never just one straight path. It was just a series of doors that opened for me. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about Suki. So when I was in my PhD program, I wanted to do a specific area of research for my dissertation. And every time I would come forth with a proposal, my chair would shoot it down. And so finally, I just thought, well, if I'm going to get this degree, I'm going to need to do her research. So I did. And when I got my first academic position at Central Washington University, I continued with that research, but it was not exciting for me. I think for me, I need to have something that I'm highly invested in to keep going with it. My wife's cousin, Suki, is one of those people, and I think that the word is overused, but I would say that Suki's genius level. She had a full ride scholarship to Yale for her undergraduate, and then she took the GRE and scored the 99th percentile in verbal, quantitative, and analytic. So she's brilliant. And she wanted to get a PhD in clinical psychology, so she chose UCLA. And when she was finished with that, she decided that that's really not what she wanted to do. She wanted to be a pediatrician. So she only applied to UCLA and got into their med school. And on her first day of her final rotation, which was pediatrics, she was driving home and she was hit by a drunk driver and she was killed. She left her husband, a 3-year-old, and a 3-month-old daughter. We went to Suki's funeral that was held at UCLA, And during the memorial service, her PhD advisor was talking about the dissertation study that she had done, and she took on a much larger project than even anybody there had ever taken on. But it was research that could actually make a difference in people's lives. So we were driving home from the funeral, and my wife, Susan, I was talking to her, and I said, I've got to do different research than what I'm doing. I need to do something like what Suki did that can make a difference in the world. And Susan said, so what do you want to do? Well, I grew up from the time I was 12, we moved to Colorado, and I lived in Jefferson County, Colorado. And this was about a year after Columbine. And so I was familiar with Columbine High School, didn't go there, but our football team frequently lost to them. And I said, I guess I want to understand why kids are bringing guns to school and killing each other. And so I started studying this area. And what I found is that there were people that were well-funded and more intelligent than me who were studying school shooters at the time. But what wasn't being studied was averted school shootings. So in 2001 is when I switched my research to try to understand how do we prevent violence. And so my first project on that, about this time I was hired at Indiana University, and I got a grant to study averted school shootings and school captive takings at the same time. At the time, nobody had done this research on averted school shootings, and there was no research out there on school captive takings or hostage takings. One of the people in the research that I was citing a lot was Greg Vecchi, who was at the behavioral science unit, and he published quite a bit in hostage taking. And so I sent him an email with a manuscript that I had been working on school captive takings, and told him that I loved his research and he might be interested in this. He ended up calling me and inviting me out to Quantico, and over the years we've developed quite a great friendship and working relationship. As Allison said, that turned into our first major project together, which was Ghost Rap. We went to a prison and we interviewed several people who had been convicted of hostage taking / kidnapping. And what we wanted to understand is what motivated people to do this, as well as what tactics, techniques, and procedures did they use. So we wanted to understand it from their perspective. And again, this is research that hadn't been done. As this study was, the first study in this area was winding up, Greg retired, as by then he had already been promoted to the unit chief of the behavioral science unit, but then he retired. Nobody at the BSU picked up this research. Nobody else was interested in it. I tried for about 3 or 4 years to get funding for it, and that didn't happen. So as I was about ready to hang that study up, one of the people that worked on Ghost Rap with me introduced me to the FBI team down in Clarksburg. And they were starting a study on police officers who had been ambushed. And so I started working with them on that. And that was a huge project. It took us about 5 years to analyze all the data on that. And that came out in book form in 2019. Around the time this was finishing up, Greg contacted me and said he wanted to write a book, and would I be willing to work with him on this, looking at mass, or what we call active killers. And he wanted me to kind of do the research component of this, lit review and analyze some cases. So of course I was excited to do that. And then just more recently, for about the last year now, the same group that I was working with on the ambushes, we're starting a study on police officer suicide. So that's kind of how I got here. It was just, one door would close and another one would open right away. And so I feel very fortunate in that regard. So what am I talking about today with this whole fatal grievances thing? First off, and this is where I'm going to ask you to unmute, because I'd like you to answer the question, what comes to your mind when I say mass violence?
Harm being done to other people at a large scale.
Okay, large scale harm to others. Great.
I think there's an FBI definition. It's like four or more killed in a single incident.
Yeah, there's different definitions. FBI says 4 or more. Most other researchers say 3 or more.
I just think of pain and agony for the families.
Yeah.
I think immediately of things like Columbine and the elementary school shooting, all of those, the one that we just passed the anniversary of, that's what immediately comes to mind.
Right. Excellent answers. And I'm glad you said that because I think many people will think of Columbine, Uvalde, Texas, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School down in Parkland, Florida, or the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, or the Las Vegas shooting. So what do all of these that I just mentioned here, what do these have in common?
Somebody was angry over something.
Okay, good. I want you to hold on to that response because that's where we're going with this. The other commonality is that these were all mass shootings. And so what I want us to consider is some other events. How many of you heard of Bath, Michigan? Or Nice, France? I do not-
Nice, France was the truck barreling through the crowd.
Yes. I don't speak.
Wasn't there also a case of a large knifing that took place on London Bridge?
Yep, there was the knifing on London Bridge. There were several automobile incidents in London. A lot of the school killings in China are knife, sword, or even meat cleaver. I don't know how to pronounce Romanian Sapoca Hospital, but that's how I'll pronounce it. Bath, Michigan was an elementary school. There were 44 fatalities, 58 injuries. It was back in 1927. And a disgruntled member of the school board planted bombs under the school and blew it up. People don't remember that or don't know about that, but that's the most devastating of the school attacks in terms of number of injuries and fatalities. Nice was the truck driving through a crowd of people, 86 fatalities, 458 injuries. At the hospital in Romania, 7 fatalities and 6 injuries. The individual used a metal infusion stand. So one of those stands that holds an IV bag. Went and killed 7 people and injured 6. And so I think my point that I'm trying to make here is that of all mass killings throughout the world, 25% of them involve the use of something other than a firearm. And if we only focus on mass shootings, therefore we're missing a huge amount of these incidents. So we're studying, we've chosen to call them active killers rather than active shooters. We believe that the weapon that they choose is secondary to other things that are going on. And especially if we're trying to intervene and prevent some of these cases, we need to understand more of the dynamics that are going on for that person than what weapon they choose. So just as a way of clarification, there's 3 types of mass murder or multiple murders. Serial murder is the killing of 2 or more people by the same person or persons. There have been serial killers that were a team. These are usually sexually motivated, and there's usually quite a time span between killings. They call it a cool-off period. A spree murder is where 2 or more people are killed at more than one location by the same individual or persons, and they're in separate events, but they're over a short period of time. So the New York or the Washington, D.C. snipers, or in 2020, there was a huge case up in Nova Scotia, Canada, where 28 people were murdered in a spree that lasted for about 24 hours or so. And then mass murder, which is what we're looking at. We've chosen to use the more common definition of 3 or more victims by the same offender in one location over a short period of time. The reason we chose 3 is because that's what most of the research literature looks at. And we're also more interested again in what led up to this. And so even if 2 people are killed, but multiple people were injured because the intention was there to kill more than 2, we would also consider that a mass attack. One of the first things we need to understand about why people kill is what their motive is. And there's 5 predominant motives that have been identified in the research. These are power, loyalty, ideology, profit, and grievance. We're defining motive as 1 or more stimuli that are internal or external to the person that propel them to act. So basically, motive represents the why behind a criminal activity. The reason I've highlighted grievance or revenge is because that's what our focus is on. This is what we're able to study. This is, in fact, as we'll see, the majority of mass killings are grievance-based. %70 of mass shootings in the United States take place in schools, college campuses, and workplaces. Most all of these are motivated by a grievance. And so this is why we're focused on these locations and the grievance motive. All of us have grievances throughout our life. There are people who will offend us. There will be people who will mistreat us. They'll treat us unfairly. Excuse me. But we have the capacity to work through these, to resolve them, to move on. So how does one of these seemingly normal grievances boil over into somebody engaging in mass violence? And that's really the question that we took on when we started this project. There's a couple of ingredients that are critically important. One ingredient is a crisis. Almost every single, and we're talking between 85 and 90% of mass killers experienced a crisis prior to their attack. So a crisis really is intense emotionality. The person moves into the emotion realm rather than the cognitive realm. So they're feeling rather than thinking. They believe that the situation is overwhelming and that it's a threat to them either psychologically, emotionally, or physically. Another ingredient is their perceptions or their beliefs. So we conceptualize it like this. A person has a perception of a crisis. They perceive that it's surpassed their ability to cope. They believe that nobody can or is willing to help them. They've tried everything, nothing helps. They experience a recent loss, which is the typical trigger to the crisis. Or they may lack social supports. They may feel wronged or feel persecuted. And when these come together in this mixture, they enter what we call the fatal grievance. So we came up with this through 3 areas, or three avenues of it arriving at this idea here. One of them was extensive literature review. We've read, I think it's safe to say that between the 3 of us, we've read everything that's been written on mass killers and grievances. Years of professional experience. So like I said, I've been studying violence prevention since 2001. Greg has been in law enforcement for over 30 years. He taught crisis and hostage negotiation at the FBI Academy, and he's been actively engaged in threat assessment during that time as well. So he's got a lot of experience out in the field dealing with people in crisis. We then analyzed 64 cases of both completed and averted active school, campus, and workplace killings throughout the world. And through those analyses and all of this supports this notion of this fatal grievance, as well as the additional stuff that I'll be getting into here. We also think that it's really important to not just look at the person's psychological background or sociological background, but it's important to focus on behavior. We make a distinction between what we call a direct and indirect behavior that are associated with fatal grievances. Most of the current research, as well as anytime there's a mass shooting, the pundits on CNN and the politicians, they focus predominantly on these indirect behaviors. These are concerning behaviors that indirectly relate to the stages of planned lethal violence, but they don't have predictive, forecasting, or preventive value. So they either don't occur with enough regularity to be predictive, they're not unique to active killers, or they're rare among active killers. So, for instance, we can look at demographics. The overwhelming demographic that we see is that about 95 to 97% of active killers are males. So we can say that's a pretty important thing to look at. But if we're only looking at males, then we're going to miss Jennifer San Marco, who in 2006 went to her former place of employment and shot and killed 7 people. So demographics, yes, they're important, some of them more than others, but we can't become myopic by focusing in on demographics. Leakage is a situation where a person in some way communicates their intent to engage in violence. Leakage is more common among school shootings than among adult college campus or workplace killers. In fact, about 70% of school shooters engage in some form of leakage. They either tell somebody their plans, or in the case of the Columbine shooters, things like making a videotape of them going on a shooting spree in their school for one of their school projects. By the way, I'm not naming any of these people. There's a push right now called Don't Name Them. And we want to more honor the victims rather than glorifying or make celebrity status of the killers. And so I will not be naming them here, although I did already mention Jennifer San Marco, but that's the only person I'll mention. Indirect behaviors of mental illness. This is focused on a lot since Sandy Hook. This is important to look at. A lot of studies of mass killers have looked at mental illness, and they've come up with some common disorders that have been identified: depression, personality disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other thought disorders. But it's about 34% of active killers were actually diagnosed with a psychological disorder prior to the attack. But mental illness is also, if we look at the flip side of the same coin, less than 0.1% of people with a mental disorder will become active killers. And so when you put it that way, it's not predictive. Knowing that somebody has bipolar disorder or major depression doesn't really tell us anything about whether they're going to become an active killer or not. So that's why, again, we're calling these indirect. background factors such as, child abuse or poor work history or dishonorable discharge from the military. These tend to be somewhat common among active killers, but among the whole population who have these difficult background factors, the vast majority will never even consider taking a gun and killing other people, let alone doing it. And then engagement with violent media. This was big after Columbine. This notion that the killers were, they played Doom on their computers or they listened to Marilyn Manson. If you look at the number of youth today who are playing violent video games or listening to violent music or watching violent movies, you'd probably have to put almost every adolescent in the category of, uh-oh, this is concerning. So again, I don't want to overkill this, but just give some examples of why we think these are less important in predicting or preventing lethal violence. So we say that indirect behaviors are concerning but not predictive. So I'm going to take a step back from behaviors for a few minutes, and I want to just talk about some foundational assumptions of our work together. So number one, the focus on indirect behaviors is ineffective. Number two, assessment and analysis of detectable behaviors is an avenue that's going to be much more fruitful in identifying and intervening to prevent an active killing. School, campus, and workplace attacks are almost entirely motivated by a grievance or revenge. And here's kind of an important one, number four. Active killers progress along a predictable pathway of escalating detectable behaviors. And if we can correctly assess and analyze these behaviors, we can intervene to interrupt the attacker's plans. So for our direct behaviors, this is essentially our model right here. We find that once a person has developed a fatal grievance, they go along, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, they go along this progression, starting with ideation and intent. So violent ideation is the thought of engaging in violence. So I'm in crisis. I've tried to resolve this to the best of my ability. People have mistreated me. They've undermined me. I've reached out to people to try to get help, and nobody is either able or willing to help me out. And at some point, if I've entered this fatal grievance, I'm going to start thinking, well, there have been a lot of people lately who have resolved their problems by killing people. And by the way, I might be able to become a celebrity, which is a big issue, especially in school shootings. So that's that ideation. We really can't observe ideation because this is all going on. This is fantasy. Intent, though, is more of a behavioral manifestation of the ideation. This is where they engage in the goal of carrying out an attack. This is where most likely to be observed through leakage. The person is likely to verbalize, especially if it's an adolescent, they'll verbalize the ideation to somebody. It may be on an online chat room or somewhere. If we don't intervene here, and the crisis isn't resolved, they're likely then to move into research and planning. Research is a solitary activity. We probably can't observe this. Planning, though, is designing a method for engaging in the attack. There are some behaviors that we can see here. In schools, oftentimes, what we found in the averted cases is trying to recruit somebody to help them. I've got this plan. I went to one school, for instance, where 6 people were planning to shoot multiple people at the school and plant bombs. And how they got caught was they went to another student and asked if he would look at their plan and tell them any problems that were with it. Well, then, of course, he turned them in and it was foiled. If we don't intervene, if the crisis isn't resolved, they'll move into preparing and optimizing. So preparing, again, is more cognitive. They're preparing themselves. They're developing a warrior mentality, this sort of thing. But the preparing, the optimizing then is gathering the means of attack. And so it would be gathering weapons and supplies, maybe a Kevlar vest. It would include things like training, practicing, probing, so checking out the intended location and where do people tend to congregate, or where are the difficult areas to get in, where are the simple areas to get in. If we don't intervene here, then we move into the final stage, which is the breaching and the attacking. The breaching is the gaining access to the site, and then the attacking. And at this point, it's all reactionary. We can prevent up to this point. Now, there were a couple averted school cases that were averted during the breaching phase before any injuries occurred, but generally, once the breach has been made, we're reactionary. So I've been talking about the fatal grievance. I've just kind of walked you through this pathway. Here's another way to look at the fatal grievance. We have a normative grievance. We have perceptions that these people have wronged us. We then go into crisis for some reason. Something happens that puts us in crisis, and that leads us on this fatal grievance pathway. So how do we assess all of this? Well, number one, we need to assess baselines and anomalies. So an example of this, Greg has been around guns his whole life. He's FBI retired, he's military retired, he collects guns. He's got guns everywhere. If Greg goes out and buys several new guns and stockpiles a bunch of ammunition, that's baseline for him. That's nothing weird. That's Greg. If I started collecting a bunch of guns and ammunition, that's anomalous. That's off baseline for me. And that should be cause of concern. So we're going to look at these baselines for this individual. We're also going to look at their anomalies. We're going to use multiple associate observers. We don't want to do an assessment based upon one person's report. So if it's in a school, we want to talk to the friend who's reported a concern. We'll want to talk to teachers and see if they've noticed any anomalous behaviors. Anomalies can be either increases in concerning behavior or decreases in behaviors that the student used to engage in. For instance, one of the commonalities across school shooters that were decent students is we see a real drop in their academic performance in the months leading up to it. So we're looking for these sorts of things. We'll want to talk to coaches or counselors or anybody else, a parent who is able to tell us what's baseline and what's anomalous for this person. We're going to assess the imminency and immediacy of planned lethal violence. So imminency means we're getting close. It's about to happen. Immediacy is we're right on the cusp of it happening. If we don't do something right now, it will happen. So kind of where on this pathway is this person? We'll assess the presence of our direct behaviors. And then we're going to assess the presence of indirect behaviors. Again, indirect behaviors serve as behavioral flags that are used to allow us to really watch and assess what's happening for this person. So we've developed levels of threat. Marginal is no direct behavioral indicators. So this might be somebody reports to a counselor that they're concerned about a student. In this case, we're going to informally monitor and we're going to take a watch and wait approach. If it becomes evident that this person is in crisis or has a fatal grievance, that's a minimal level of threat. We're going to formally monitor. So we'll sit the student down or the employee down, and we're going to talk to them. And we're going to watch and report, which means we're going to write reports. We're going to document everything. A probable threat means they've now entered the violent ideation and intent stage. We'll either use informal or formal third-party intermediaries to intervene. So a third-party intermediary might be a trusted teacher. It might be a family member. We're not going to just hand it over to them, but we'll be involved with them as they try to intervene. An imminent threat is that they're in the research and planning stage. If we don't intervene right now, an attack is imminent. This is where we'll now engage in formal third-party interventions. So a formally trained threat assessment team, for instance, or direct intervention. And then immediate threat is now they're preparing and optimizing. Direct intervention, threat assessment team. It might also include alerting first responders, so calling the police and having that person apprehended so that they don't carry it out. So back in 2011, I wrote an article with Dwayne Fuselier. Yeah, sorry. Now, Dwayne is an interesting guy. Dwayne's a retired police or FBI hostage negotiator. He was stationed at the Denver field office when he got a call that there was a terrorist attack at Columbine High School. He got in his car and he rushed over there and he set up the command center. And he was the head of the command center for the FBI, because at first they didn't know what was happening. They really thought it was a terrorist attack. It wasn't until later that night, after he had been doing his job all day, that he found out his son, who attended Columbine High School, was okay. So this model comes through hostage or crisis negotiations. And this is what we will do with somebody who's along this fatal grievance pathway. Start off with active listening skills. We're not coming in and trying to solve the problem right now. We are listening. What is going on? We're going to ask open-ended questions. We're going to maintain appropriate eye contact. We're going to show interest. We're going to reflect back the things that they're saying. We're going to reflect their feelings, all of these active listening skills. And as we do that, we're trying to establish empathy for this person. What must it feel like for this person to be in this crisis? When we've established that empathy, we now need to communicate that empathy to that person. This might be the first time that this person in crisis feels like somebody has actually heard and understood them. When they feel that we can empathize with them and that we understand them, we've developed rapport. And when we've developed rapport, they'll start to trust us. And this happens every time in a crisis negotiation. Well, I should say every time that's successfully resolved through crisis negotiations. Once they've trusted us, we can then influence them. This is where we start to work with them on solutions to the crisis. And as we come up with possible solutions to the crisis, now we can change their behavior. So it's our belief that a crisis leads to the person's feeling of a need to attack others. If we can eliminate the crisis, we've eliminated the need to attack. And that's what this whole model is built upon, using crisis negotiation skills. So that's what we've been doing. That's what we've developed. What's next for us? I need to validate our model with a much larger data set. 64 cases is decent, but I need to do a more thorough analysis. The other thing I need to do is I'd like to start developing an active killer database. If you Google, there are a lot of excellent databases out there on mass shooters, but there's nothing out there on mass killers that includes attacks that are with anything other than a firearm. So I'd like to develop a database of these incidences and then continue to analyze data as we go along. The other thing is we're developing a nonprofit, the three of us, Greg, Marianne, and I. we want to take this knowledge that we've developed and these skills, and we want to take it to the schools, and we want to teach people there so that they can develop threat assessment teams and intervention teams in the schools. And we want to be able to do that to them free of charge. So we're in the process of putting together a nonprofit where we'll seek additional money so that we can then go to school districts and do this sorts of training. So conclusion, most mass killers are motivated by a fatal grievance, and they're in crisis. If we resolve the crisis, then the need to kill will, at least in theory, be eliminated. Good assessment and analysis are required for appropriate intervention. So thank you for your attentiveness and participation. Now, what questions or discussion do you have?
So I have a question for you.
Okay.
I have always grown up around guns, and I have a respect for them in, a way that they are a way of protection for me and my family in the household, but I'm also a hunter.
Mhm.
See them as a way to provide. Now, obviously, I would never consider becoming a mass killer or anything like that. But do you think that a program within schools of teaching kids ways around guns, that they, sort of like a hunter's education course where they are taught the basics and kind of develop a respect for guns as I believe that it should be. Do you think that would be beneficial?
I think it would be beneficial. I don't know that it would eliminate mass killings, because again, we don't focus so much on the weapon of choice. I was giving info at the beginning of this that China has had a rash of school killings, and that they've all been slashings, and some of them, multiple fatalities and injuries. So I think a person who has a fatal grievance, they're going to carry it out regardless of what weapon they can get a hold of. I do believe, though, that responsible gun ownership and respect for how to handle guns is important. If somebody's going to be around them, they need to really respect them and understand them and know what they can do.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay.
Can you describe the character of the fatal grievance of some of these school shooters? I have never been able to understand what prompted, what was in the minds of these people to seek out a school and go shoot kids. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, so 80% of school shootings are internal. So it means that they're a student or a former student of that school.
Okay.
In some cases, they develop a hit list. So they have a grievance against an individual or a group. It doesn't have to be a person. It could be the jocks. It could be the whoever's. And so they go in there with the intent of killing as many of those people as they can. In the process, they end up just indiscriminately killing in most cases. Others, they choose the school for its symbolic representation. The school itself is seen as the cause of the grievance. Perhaps failure, perhaps they've been bullied on multiple occasions and the school failed to act. For others, it's also symbolic that a school is supposed to be our safest place. It's a safe haven for children to go and learn. And so they choose that to kind of flaunt the fact that I can do this with impunity. One of these indirect behaviors of school shooters, among many of them, is this notion of I'm finally going to take control. And I will have so much control that I get to decide who lives and dies. And so really they're looking at this school as a symbol of what's wrong in their life. These are not typically short-term solutions that they come up with. The Columbine killers, they planned for well over a year. I just saw the other day, we have the trial of the Parkland shooter, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas school, that he had been preparing for this thing for well over a year. So this is something that's been festering with these people for years before they take on any action. And they've just gotten to the point where they don't see any other solution. And this is a way for many of them to go out with a bang, no pun intended, but to go out in a blaze of glory. Does that answer your question?
For shooting first and second graders?
Well, so I believe that the Uvalde, Texas killer and the Connecticut, the older I get, the more my brain draws blanks. Anyway, I think Sandy Hook, thank you. I believe those were symbolic. They were attacking an institution rather than going specifically at kids, young innocent children. I think they were symbolically going after young and innocent children because they represented an easy target and something that would really hit home what they've done and what they were able to accomplish. Doesn't make sense for most of us, but in their mind it does. In their mind, it's like, yeah, this is what I need to do to really show the world how much I've been grieved.
I've got a question about leakage.
Okay.
You had mentioned that in schools it's easy to, or I guess I think I don't want to. I'll try to paraphrase what I think you said. That it's seen more in the school atmosphere, school shooters, things like that, and not really seen in adult cases. Do you think that the adult cases are just harder to identify, or has your research shown that they just don't do it, as they don't show it? Because it just seems to me that leakage really is on everybody. It's just a matter of being able to see it. And I think kids are a little bit more, they don't realize they're doing as much. Maybe adults have a little bit more of that ability to disguise it.
Yeah, I think you really hit on, to me, it's a developmental issue in many respects. For a 16 or 15-year-old that's feeling like they've been wronged for years at school, leakage can be kind of a way to try to pound the chest, if you will. You know, it's like, yeah, you just wait, because this is what I'm going to do to you. And it allows them an opportunity to try to get some credibility. I think for older adults that are, you know, the average workplace shooter is mid-30s. Either they don't have as large a social network as students do, so they can be more anonymous, or developmentally, they realize that, you know, telling other people my plans is likely to interrupt it. And if I really want to go through with this, then why would I tell anybody? I'm just going to go do it. So does that get at your question?
Yeah, that's sort of what my belief was too. I just wanted to, you had mentioned that, and that kind of piqued my curiosity as far as research what you had seen. And I think it really is developmental. I think that they still have leakage. They just are very selective on who they're telling. So maybe a girlfriend, or, you know, a very close friend or family member, and that's about all they'll do. They usually don't do a lot until the day of the, you know, they might post a manifesto or a video or something like that the day it's happening or right before it happens. But other than that, it's pretty quiet. So, all right,
yeah,
thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think also that the leaking may be more sophisticated, more subtle, and so that would be something to look at. Now, the one thing you mentioned is manifestos, and we call that a legacy token. And this is where most active killers don't have an exit plan. They're suicidal, and their intention is to die at the location, either by their own hand or by the police. So fewer adolescents in schools leave legacy tokens. They leak. More adults leave legacy tokens, and they're less likely to leak. So they, the Virginia Tech shooter sent those videos out to, I think it was NBC News, on the day that he engaged in the attack. A legacy token is essentially a claiming of responsibility, manifesto. This is why the killer in San Bernardino, California. No, not San Bernardino.
There's one in El Paso, Texas at the Walmart. He did that as well, I think.
Yeah.
There's a few, but yeah, I agree. I think the adults, that's where you get more of that legacy token and things like that. So but yeah, okay. Like I said, I wanted to hear your research and thoughts on that leakage, because I think it just appears in a different form, but it's still there.
Yeah, excellent point.
Jeff, there are 2 questions from chat from Nancy. Would controlling of bullying in the schools be beneficial?
So after Columbine, almost all funding and research went into bullying, anti-bullying programs. As a parent of a 16-year-old who attends MHS, I don't think we've really done much by way of bullying. In fact, from what she reports, there's more bullying now than when I was in school. I think bullying can help a lot of students. Anti-bullying, I'm saying, can help a lot of students who are being bullied. But again, I'm not seeing, my daughter was bullied mercilessly last year, even in the classroom. And I don't know how many times we talked with administration there, and nothing was ever really done. The bully was given in-school suspension once, but once he got back, the bullying continued. So I think what we need to do is do a better job of handling bullying rather than doing what we've been doing, which doesn't seem to be working. If we can effectively, so again, among school shooters, many of them were either bullied or were the bullies. And in the case of those that were bullied, they almost all reported that when I went to somebody at the school about it, nothing was done. And in many cases, it made matters worse. So I think we need to really focus more on how do the adults respond to this and intervene so that we take that, that trauma away from the victim of the bully. Do you believe that media attention leads to some mass killings? Yes, there's some pretty good evidence that following a major news event, mass killing, that we have copycats in the months following. This is partially why the Don't Name Them campaign came out. This was parents of some of the victims at one of the school shootings. They said, I saw the name and the face of the shooter constantly on the news, but I never saw my child who was killed. I never saw the names of the people who were killed. Let's stop naming them, because we're turning them into kind of Wild West gunslinger celebrities, right? And there's a group out of Minnesota, they run a program called the Violence Project, and they talk about the extent of basically making school shooters or mass killers into celebrities, and how most shooters now study prior shootings. and they're aware of them. They know what's going on, and they'll often use strategies that worked well and try to improve on them. After Columbine, many of the school shooters, one of their goals was, can I have a higher body count than the 2 from Columbine? So yeah, we do know that media attention exacerbates this problem.
I had a question, Dr. Daniels.
Mhm.
Oh, by the way, thank you for this talk. I really appreciate the model you developed, because I think that really guides your research in a way you can know what to look for.
Yeah.
Instead of just combing all this immense amount of data. Anyway, the question I have is, and by the way, I'm glad you did say, because a lot of people confuse this type of behavior with mentally ill people.
Mhm.
And I think that's the confusion for many, I mean, who would do this except people that are mentally ill? Which kind of leads to my question. I'm trying to think of your crisis leading to that fatal grievance.
Mhm.
And we all have crises, right?
Exactly.
People do lose their jobs and they don't engage in mass violence. Divorces, abuse. I mean, unfortunately, there is a lot of these kinds of unfortunate crises of behavioral.
Mhm.
So what do you think puts somebody to that next level? About
Well,
these people, what it is about these individuals that are pushing them into that level of engaging and et cetera, et cetera.
I'm just gonna kind of shoot off the cuff here because I don't have any data on this. My guess is these are people who probably don't have good coping skills to begin with.
Okay.
These are probably people who they tend to be more socially isolated, so that they don't have good social support systems to help them. If I've had a really lousy day, I go home, I talk to my wife, and guess what? I feel better afterwards. If I go home and I'm alone and I don't have anybody else to call, what's going to happen with that? That's going to fester for me. My guess is that these also are people who, among school shooters, and I've not seen whether this research has been done among adult mass killers, but a common characteristic of school shooters is that they're what have been termed injustice collectors. And so these are the kids that every slight that's ever happened to them stings, and they remember it and they hold on to it. And somebody insults them, they're going to carry that with them. They don't have the oil on the duck's back that allows the water to run off, right? They're going to hold on to these things. And I think you couple that injustice collection with isolation, inability to cope, poor coping strategies, these sorts of things. I think that's what then puts them into this crisis and those perceptions that I talked about of inability to cope, and nobody can help me, nobody will help me. And that's what then puts them on this fatal grievance pathway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Nancy, did I answer your questions on the bullying and media attention?
I had a question. Is there any way to, like, I don't know, foresee the people that might, I mean, are there signs that you can look out for that says, hey, this person is more, possible to do this versus somebody who just has the ideation, like, that this person is actually going to go through with it?
Well, that's kind of what our model is hoping to define, is that if somebody is in those early stages, and we can see some of those early stage signs of crisis, and maybe even some intention has been communicated, can we get in there and intervene early enough to get them off this pathway? Because again, we're taking from hostage negotiation what works there, and now we're trying to apply it in a different context. And so in practice in one area, and then in theory in this area, if we can help them resolve that crisis, they'll get off that fatal grievance pathway. As those behaviors escalate along this pathway, communicating to somebody that I've thought about shooting up my school is different than I've acquired weapons and I'm now out in the park. The Columbine killers, for instance, tested several of their pipe bombs out in the park in the weeks before the attack. When we see these sorts of things, it's escalated much farther along, and we have to be much more forceful in our interventions at that point. But yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do, is recognize what these early warning signs. And my hope is that as we get into this and we collect more pointed data, we can actually develop better lists of what types of warning behaviors we see at each of these stages. Right now, some of them are still a little bit vague, just because the research hasn't been done in this area yet to say, what behaviors other than communication might we see if somebody has violent ideation or intent, for instance.
Forgive me, I have another question.
Okay.
Has your research extended into picking up cases where an intervention has apparently been successful, has taken place and has been successful, that would give you more insight into the kinds of people, the observations that might be made in advance?
Slightly. I helped the Police Foundation develop a database of averted school shootings. And so we used that for our data of the averted cases. When I developed that database with them many years ago, we didn't have this model yet. So, data is only as good as what you put into it. And the data for showing specific behaviors here on the interventions just doesn't exist yet. What we do know is that in most cases of averted school shootings, somebody else came forward and either reported concerns or had experienced some leakage, for instance, a direct threat or some other warning behaviors, came forward and reported it to another person who then investigated and prevented the shooting from happening. I did a study back in the early 2000s where I went to 6 schools that had averted a school shooting. And I only went to schools where there had been enough evidence for a conviction of the individual who was plotting it, and came up with some characteristics and what sorts of things worked. And again, it was mostly kind of that see something, say something. That's so important.
Well, I would also like to take this time to say thank you very much. This is a very thought-provoking presentation. I think there's more going on in my head to think about that I haven't formulated questions at this point, but I do want to thank you for taking the time to do this presentation. So thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. And thank you so much for inviting me. Like I said, I was very excited when I got the invitation to do this. So